June 1944. The war had reached its cruel peak. Cities lay in ruins. Soldiers marched endlessly across battlefields soaked with blood, and the entire world seemed to groan under the weight of endless destruction. But in the middle of this storm, something entirely unexpected happened. Something so small and ordinary in peacetime, yet so extraordinary and almost miraculous in war. German prisoners of war, weary and broken from the brutal fighting in Europe, were brought across the ocean to camps in the United States. As the trains screeched to a halt and the prisoners stepped off, chains of fear clung to their hearts. They expected the worst. They thought they would be beaten, starved, or perhaps even executed slowly and cruelly. Their minds had been filled with images painted by propaganda back home, terrifying pictures of Americans as monsters who would show no mercy to their enemies. The men shuffled into the camp, their boots heavy with mud, their uniforms torn, their faces covered with days of grime, and their eyes hollow from months of fighting. They clutched their few belongings tightly, as if the enemy might snatch even the last scraps of their identity away. Inside the barbed wire fences, the air was heavy with silence, broken only by the shuffle of boots and the distant commands of American guards. Many prisoners kept their heads down, unwilling to meet the eyes of the men with rifles watching them. They whispered to one another in German, their voices trembling, wondering if this would be the place where their suffering reached its final merciless end. And then it happened. As they were lined up, they were directed not toward harsh punishment or dark, filthy cells, but toward a long building from which steam poured like mist into the summer sky. At first, they could not believe what the guards were saying. Duschen, the word spread among them. Showers, the Americans wanted them to shower. Some laughed in disbelief, others stared with suspicion. Could this be a trick? Perhaps they were being marched into gas chambers like the ones they had heard whispered about in hushed tones across Europe. Fear gripped their stomachs as they walked closer, but when the doors opened and they stepped inside, the truth revealed itself with the hiss of pipes and the rush of water falling from dozens of showerheads. It was not poison, not death, not cruelty. It was hot water, pouring down in heavy streams, splashing on the tiles, filling the air with steam. For men who had lived in trenches, who had marched for weeks without washing, who had been covered in dirt, sweat and blood for what felt like years, this was no ordinary sight. This was salvation. At first, some of them stood frozen, unsure if they could trust their eyes. One man slowly extended his hand into the stream of water, half expecting pain. But when the warmth touched his skin, he gasped, then laughed aloud, the sound breaking the heavy silence of the room. Others followed, some timidly, some with reckless eagerness, stripping away their dirty uniforms and stepping into the streams. The sensation of the hot water was almost too much for them to bear. It ran over their tired muscles, loosening the knots of pain that had built over months of battle. It washed away the layers of dust and blood, revealing pale, scarred skin beneath. Some tilted their faces up, letting the water pour into their eyes, their mouths, their hair, as if they were trying to drink in not just the water, but the humanity behind it. A few men began to laugh uncontrollably, like children discovering a secret treasure. Others closed their eyes and wept quietly, the sound of their sobs mixing with the rushing water. For the first time in so long, they were clean. For the first time, they felt like men again, not animals driven into the mud of war. The room was filled with steam, and in that steam, it felt as if the boundaries of war melted away for just a moment. Here they were not enemies, not soldiers of Hitler, not prisoners defined by barbed wire. They were simply human beings, standing naked under hot water, rediscovering the simple dignity of being alive. Some prisoners reached for the soap bars provided, rubbing away layers of filth until their skin turned raw and pink, as though they were trying to scrub away the very memories of the battlefield. For many of them, it was more than just a shower. It was a reminder that somewhere beyond the hatred, there was still a trace of compassion in the world. The shock spread quickly among the prisoners. This cannot be real. one murmured in disbelief, his voice shaking as he let the water run down his arms. Another replied softly, "If this is captivity, it is kinder than the freedom we had in the war." Men who had been taught to believe that Americans were cruel demons began to see something different in that hot steam. It was not luxury, but it was mercy. It was not softness, but it was dignity. And dignity was something they had lost long ago on the battlefields of Europe. When the showers finally ended, the prisoners emerged transformed. Their hair clung wetly to their foreheads. Their faces shone with a freshness they had forgotten, and their shoulders, once slumped with exhaustion, seemed a little straighter. They wrapped themselves in clean towels provided by the camp and looked at one another with wide eyes as if they had just shared a secret miracle. In whispers, they spread the story to others who had not yet experienced it, their voices carrying both disbelief and awe. The hot showers became the first story the new arrivals would hear. Some even wondered if this was part of a psychological trick by the Americans, a way to soften their spirits. But no matter how they tried to reason it, the feeling remained. For the first time since the war began, they had been treated not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as human beings. The memory of that first hot shower stayed with many of them for the rest of their lives. In letters home, carefully written under the eyes of censors, they tried to describe it to their families without revealing too much detail. They hinted at kindness, at decency, at something shocking that contradicted everything they had been told. And long after they left the camps, they would recall the steam rising into the air, the sound of water echoing in the tiled rooms, the laughter and tears that mixed together in that extraordinary moment. For men who had walked through hell, those showers were more than water. They were proof that even in war, humanity could still break through the cracks of hatred. The sound of water pouring in neat rows of shower rooms echoed through the camp like a melody the prisoners had forgotten existed, like a piece of life stolen from another world where war did not exist. The echoes bounced off the tiled walls, filling the space with a rhythm that was both alien and comforting. Many of the German soldiers could not stop themselves from laughing as the water splashed over their bodies. Laughter that was almost uncontrollable, strange and childlike, as though they had been transported back to a time before the war, before blood and fire had consumed their youth. But alongside the laughter came silence too, silence filled with trembling shoulders and lowered heads, where men stood motionless with their eyes closed, tears mingling with the streams of water running down their cheeks. They were not crying from pain or fear, but from the shock of kindness, from the relief that someone, even an enemy, had allowed them to feel human again. In the thick fog of steam, the prisoners' faces blurred, yet one could still sense the emotions carried in the air, as though the showers had created an invisible bond between them all, a bond of rediscovered humanity. Their expectations had been entirely different. Many had braced themselves for starvation rations, for beatings at the hands of guards, for sleeping in mud or on cold stone floors. They had imagined themselves reduced to skeletons, wasting away in camps run by cruel victors. The German state had fed them lies that America was a land of savages who would exploit them, humiliate them, and slowly crush them into nothingness. Instead, they were given food, warm bread, soup, vegetables, sometimes even meat, and then these showers, which to them felt like a luxury far greater than any gold. Every drop of water seemed to whisper to them that the enemy was not always what propaganda had painted. And that realization was both comforting and disturbing. It disturbed them because it challenged everything they had been told. The men looked at each other with widened eyes, whispering questions in German. Why would they do this? Why would they waste hot water on us? To a soldier who had slept in muddy foxholes and marched through rain for weeks, hot water was a treasure reserved for the privileged. Even civilians back in Germany did not always enjoy such things as the war dragged on. Now here they were, standing under a cascade of heat and steam, being offered a dignity they had not expected. One prisoner rubbed his skin until it turned red, muttering, "It feels as though I'm washing away the whole war from my body." Another simply held his hands out under the stream, staring at them as though water was some kind of miracle he had never seen before. The sight of the steam rising, filling the room, fogging the mirrors, made the camp feel almost like a bathhouse from another era. Men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in trenches now stood shoulder to shoulder again, but this time their weapons had been replaced by bars of soap. Their voices, once raised in commands and curses, now softened into murmurs and even laughter. Some prisoners who had not smiled for months found themselves chuckling at the absurdity of it all. They were supposed to be enemies, prisoners locked away behind fences, and yet here they were, laughing together like brothers in the fog of steam. Others were quiet, too moved to speak, closing their eyes and letting the hot water run down their bodies as though it could somehow cleanse not only their skin but also their souls. The clash between expectation and reality weighed heavily on them. At night in their barracks, the prisoners whispered about it in disbelief. They spoke of how, for the first time in months or even years, they felt warm, fed, and strangely safe. They remembered the bitter cold of Russian winters, the hunger of long campaigns, the stink of unwashed bodies crammed into trenches. Here, even as prisoners, they were allowed moments of dignity. The irony gnawed at them. They had been soldiers of the Reich, told they were fighting for the most advanced nation on earth, yet it was in the hands of their enemies that they rediscovered decency. One man remarked bitterly, "We were supposed to be the masters, but here as captives, we are treated better than as free men in the war." That thought sat heavy in their chests, haunting them long after the steam of the showers had faded. Still, there was no denying the joy it brought. Some men left the showers so light-hearted that they sang under their breath, old songs from childhood, melodies their mothers had once sung to them. Others, drying themselves with the towels provided, felt as though they had been reborn. Their skin was soft, their hair smelled of soap, their bodies felt lighter. The guards noticed the change too. They saw the lines of fatigue on the Germans' faces soften, saw shoulders relax, saw hardened expressions melt into something almost peaceful. For the guards, it was a strange sight. Men who had tried to kill them days or weeks before now, laughing like boys in a schoolyard. It was a reminder that war made enemies of men who, without it, might have shared a beer or a handshake. The whispers among the prisoners grew louder as days passed. "Perhaps the Americans are not what we thought," some said. "Perhaps they do not hate us as much as we were told." These thoughts were dangerous, for they planted seeds of doubt, not only about their enemy, but about the very regime they had served. If the Americans showed more humanity to prisoners than their own leaders had shown to conquered peoples, then what did that say about the war they had fought? The hot showers, simple as they were, became a symbol. They were not just about cleanliness. They were about respect, about the idea that even in captivity, dignity could exist. The men began to look forward to these showers, not just for the physical relief, but for the spiritual one. They would line up eagerly, some with joking impatience, others with quiet anticipation. When the doors opened and the steam drifted out, they walked inside with smiles instead of fear. It became a ritual, a moment where they could forget the war outside, where they could close their eyes and let water wash away not just dirt, but also despair. For many, it was the only time they truly felt alive during captivity. The paradox of it all haunted them, yet it also gave them hope. If even enemies could show mercy, then perhaps the world was not completely lost to cruelty. Perhaps when the war ended, there would still be a chance for humanity to rebuild. The hot showers of the US camps were not written in official reports or remembered in history books with fanfare, but for the men who stood beneath those streams of water, they were unforgettable. They were moments when the cruelty of war loosened its grip, when the endless hate was broken by something as simple and yet as powerful as the sound of hot water rushing over tired skin. Every shower became more than just a routine. It became a ritual, a sacred pause in the otherwise bleak existence of captivity. The Germans, hardened by years of war and indoctrination, began to anticipate the moment the pipes hissed and the water poured down like a blessing. For them, it wasn't only about washing their bodies, it was about cleansing something far deeper. They had marched under the swastika, filled with ideas of superiority, pride, and power. But when they stood naked under streams of hot water provided by those they called enemies, something inside them cracked. It was not humiliation that washed over them, it was revelation. The steam blurred their hardened faces, and in that fog they found themselves confronting questions they had never dared to ask before. Why would their enemy treat them with more dignity than their own leaders often did? Why were they shown kindness when their own government had denied such basic humanity to millions? Some of the men spoke of it openly, sitting together afterward, their hair still damp, their skin raw from scrubbing. They whispered doubts in low voices, afraid of being overheard even by their fellow prisoners. "Perhaps we have been lied to," one said, rubbing his hands together as if still feeling the heat of the water. Another shook his head, his voice trembling. "We were told we were the chosen, the mighty ones, and yet here we stand captives. And they, our enemies, give us mercy." The showers became more than an act of hygiene. They became a mirror, forcing each man to see himself not as a soldier of the Reich, but as a human being stripped of uniform, ideology, and arrogance. For many, the transformation was slow. The war had left them scarred, not only on their bodies, but also in their minds. Years of propaganda had painted a picture of Americans as savage beasts, and it was not easy to let that image dissolve. Yet every time the warm water poured over their exhausted muscles, melting away the crust of battle, their defenses weakened. The arrogant pride of superiority they had carried with them began to wash down the drains, along with the dirt and blood. They realized that here, under the watchful eyes of their guards, they were not treated as less than human. And that realization planted seeds of humility. The showers also carried unspoken symbolism. Naked and vulnerable, with nothing to hide behind, they were equals in that moment. No rank, no medals, no insignias mattered. Generals and privates stood side by side under the same streams, stripped down to what they truly were, men. The hot water seemed to wash away those invisible walls of hierarchy, even if only for a few minutes. For those who had believed in being conquerors, in standing above others, this equality was unsettling, yet strangely freeing. One man muttered as he stepped out of the steam, "It is here, not on the battlefield, that I feel most equal." The emotional weight of the showers deepened as time passed. For some, it was the only place they allowed themselves to feel. Hardened soldiers, who had not shed a tear when comrades fell beside them in battle, found themselves breaking down silently in the showers, their tears indistinguishable from the water streaming down their faces. They cried not only for themselves, but for the lives they had lived, the lies they had believed, and the destruction they had been part of. Others found laughter bursting out of them at odd moments, laughter that felt strange and foreign, like a long-lost memory of childhood joy. The showers became a place of contradictions, tears and laughter, silence and song, despair and hope, all mixing together in the rising fog. For the guards, this transformation was visible too. They watched as the prisoners, once grim and hostile, began to soften in small ways. They saw the way the Germans carried themselves differently after a shower, shoulders relaxed, faces calmer, eyes less haunted. They noticed how conversations among the prisoners changed from bitter curses to quiet reflections. The showers, though simple, were reshaping the men. The guards may not have realized it fully at the time, but what they offered was not just cleanliness. It was the chance for their captives to reconnect with the humanity that war had stolen from them. For some prisoners, these showers sparked dangerous thoughts, dangerous not to their captors, but to the beliefs they had once held. They began questioning the ideology that had led them to war in the first place. If Americans could treat their prisoners with such care, what did that mean about the stories they had been told back home? If their so-called superior nation had built a war machine that left even its own soldiers filthy, starving and broken, while the enemy provided warmth and dignity, what did that say about the truth of superiority? These questions were not spoken loudly, but they lingered in every drop of water that fell from the showerheads. Some even began to reflect inwardly on their own actions during the war. A few confessed in hushed tones that they had treated civilians and prisoners in occupied territories with cruelty, following orders without question. Now, as they stood under streams of water offered freely by their enemy, guilt began to gnaw at them. They felt the contradiction in their bones, the shame of what they had done, and the unexpected kindness they were now receiving. For some, this became the beginning of a long inner journey, one that would continue long after the war ended, as they tried to reconcile their past with what they had experienced in captivity. The showers also carried a sense of strange irony. For soldiers who had once fought with the belief that they were the feared conquerors of Europe, standing under water provided by the enemy was humbling. Yet it was in that humility that they found something profoundly human. They realized that survival was not only about power, but about compassion. They realized that true strength was not always found in weapons, but sometimes in the simple act of treating another man with decency. The showers whispered lessons to them that no battlefield had ever taught. As time went on, the showers became something sacred in the memory of these men. They were more than a physical relief. They were a quiet revolution of thought. Every drop of water that splashed onto their tired bodies carried with it the possibility of change, the possibility of seeing the world differently. And though they would return to their barracks, to the fences, to the reality of captivity, the memory of that warmth lingered. It became a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there could still be light. Even if it was just the light of steam rising from hot water. In those showers, arrogance dissolved, lies crumbled, and humanity was reborn. And though history may never mark those moments with dates or monuments, for the men who lived them, they were unforgettable. They were the first steps toward questioning the past, the first cracks in the walls built by ideology, and perhaps for some, the first glimpse of peace in a world torn apart by war. As weeks turned into months, the showers became more than a novelty. They became a legend whispered among the German POWs. A story so astonishing that new arrivals refused to believe it until they felt the hot water on their own skin. Men who had come in with hollow eyes and stiff postures slowly began to carry themselves differently, not because captivity was easy, but because it had given them something the war had taken away. The memory of being treated as a human. They had expected chains, whips, and cruelty. Instead, they received food, shelter, and showers that revived their weary souls. That shock stayed with them, and when letters were written home, always carefully inspected by censors, the men tried to slip in hints, words that would not betray secrets, but would still tell their families of this strange kindness. "We are being treated better than expected," some wrote. "There is warmth here, and we are alive." Those who read the letters back in Germany could only wonder, for it was so far from the image painted by their leaders, so different from the endless propaganda that had filled their ears. As the days rolled into seasons, those hot showers became moments of hope. In the monotony of camp life, counting the same fences, listening to the same boots of guards, eating the same food, these showers stood apart. They were the highlight, the one place where men laughed freely, where silence became sacred, and where the heaviness of war seemed to lift from their shoulders for just a little while. The simple act of bathing grew into something spiritual. Some soldiers admitted privately that they prayed under the water, whispered words of forgiveness, or begged silently for redemption. Others allowed themselves the rare comfort of closing their eyes and imagining they were home, back in Germany, standing in the bathroom of their childhood. hearing the voices of family echoing faintly from another room. For a few minutes, the war, the prison, the fences, all of it seemed very far away. The transformation went deeper than skin. It changed minds. Many of these men had entered the camps with hearts hardened by years of fighting, carrying bitterness like armor. Yet slowly, the showers began to chip away at that armor. For the first time, they began to think of Americans not as faceless enemies, but as men capable of compassion. It created cracks in the worldview they had been forced to accept. These cracks widened with each act of kindness, food given fairly, medical care offered without hesitation, and above all, the dignity of hot water shared with them. Some prisoners began to whisper that perhaps the world they thought they knew was not the truth. Perhaps there was more beyond what they had been told. Perhaps their leaders had lied, and then came the end of the war. The news spread through the camp slowly, like a wave, first in rumors and then in official announcements. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was no more. For the prisoners, it was both a relief and a sorrow. They thought of home, cities bombed, families scattered, loved ones lost. Many wept in silence, not knowing what they would return to. But through their grief, the memory of their time in the camps, and especially those showers, stayed with them. It was not the barbed wire they remembered most, nor the guards with rifles, nor the long roll calls. It was the steam, the water, the strange comfort of being given dignity by those they had once sworn to fight to the death. When the men were finally released and returned home, they carried those memories with them like invisible scars, but also like hidden treasures. In the broken streets of their homeland, amid ruins and hunger, some spoke of it to their families in quiet conversations. The hot showers, the food, the unexpected kindness. To many, it sounded like a fairy tale, unbelievable after all the horror. Yet those who had lived it knew the truth. It was real, and it had changed them. Some even admitted that the way they had been treated as prisoners softened their hatred and gave them a new perspective on the world. For them, the war did not only end with defeat, it ended with a strange lesson in humanity. The legacy of those showers lived on in the silence of their memories. Even decades later, old men who had once been young prisoners would recall it with a faraway look in their eyes. They remembered the first rush of hot water, the steam clouding their vision, the sound of laughter and weeping mixing together, and the feeling of being human again after years of being reduced to nothing more than soldiers. They told their grandchildren not of battles and victories, but of that day in an American camp when kindness stunned them more than any weapon ever could. The hot showers had become in their minds a symbol of something greater, a reminder that even in a world consumed by hatred, compassion could still exist quietly, powerfully, and forever unforgettable. And that was the most stunning part of all. Not the fences, not the rifles, not even the surrender, but the memory of warm water pouring down in the middle of war, and the truth it carried, that mercy, once shown, can never be forgotten.